Wilson. Quick. The order of the 4th Judicial District Court of the state of Utah has been carried out. Gary Mark Gilmore is dead.
Gary Gilmore has been executed by a firing squad in Utah.
Hello, in today's program we look at Gary Gilmore, a double murderer who'd spent 18 of his 35 years in jail. Gilmore was known to millions as the man who'd welcomed the death sentence passed on him and had done all he could to see it was carried out. No one had been executed in America for 10 years, and as Gilmore waited for his date with death, he became a celebrity at the center of a grisly media circus. The leader of the media pack was Larry Schiller, a photographer turned entrepreneur who bought the rights to the Gilmore story for $125,000. Schiller was able to conduct a series of interviews with the condemned man and with many of those who'd been close to Gilmore in the months before his final arrest. Schiller then asked Norman Mailer to turn this raw material into a book. Mailer broke off work on a novel and took the job on to make some money, but he was soon totally absorbed in Gilmore's story. Mailer also went to Utah to interview people, and eventually he had on tape over 300 interviews. He worked through sheaves of legal material and newspaper stories and read over 1,000 pages of letters written by Gilmore while he was in prison. He ended up with this massive book, The Executioner's Song, dealing with documentary material but using the techniques of the novelist. The story begins in the highly respectable Mormon town of Provo on the day that Gilmore arrives from prison to live with his relatives there, and it goes on to reconstruct in scrupulous detail the events of the next 9 months up to Gilmore's death. Norman Mailer's taken on America for over 30 years. He's been seen as the man on the nerve of his generation and also attacked for books thought to be not good, and he has written as many bad sentences as most good writers. But in The Naked and the Dead, for example, and The Deer Park and The Armies of the Night, and once again here, he shows his formidable talents. We wanted to find out from Mailer why Gilmore's character and crimes came to interest him so strongly, and to discuss the method and style of this book, which Mailer was finishing when we visited him in his Brooklyn apartment, which overlooks Manhattan. We also wanted to discuss what he doesn't say in the book, his own thoughts and reflections on the shooting of Gary Gilmore. Were you worried that you were merely glorifying somebody who would be better not glorified by taking on the Gilmore book?
I'm going to confess that, and this may be shocking to some people, that I worried about that to the greatest degree because I thought it would affect the fortunes of the book. You know, I naturally, like any other author, want my books to do well. And I thought, this is the hurdle. An awful lot of people are going to resent this book, and they're going to say there's something just swinish about glorifying a two-time killer and a bad man. And I'm not certain that you can defend yourself against that absolutely. There's no doubt in my mind that if you write a book, particularly a long book, about one person, you've affected their place in history. You don't even have to be a terribly good writer to do that. Once that much space and time is given to one person and there's that much reporting in the media about what's been done, you've altered the nature of that man's life and that man's record. He is taken more seriously. But I thought, on the other hand, I wasn't personally troubled by it because one of the feelings I've had for a long, long time is that, is that righteousness and self-righteousness have absolutely no place in literature, one. Obviously they don't. And Gilmore, I thought, was an absolutely fascinating phenomenon. Apart from anything I might have thought about him personally, I couldn't remember a time when a man insisted upon his own execution and then proceeded to carry it out. There are people who will say, I want to be dead. There are people who are capable of saying, you accuse me of these crimes and you convicted me of them and you sentence me, execute me. That's one thing. There are any number of criminals who can do that, any number of condemned men who can do that. But Gilmore then proceeded over a period of 3 months to carry it out as if he were a general, carrying out a campaign. And the impulse in his campaign was to, his idea of victory was his own execution. This goes beyond normal suicides. This goes beyond normal criminality. It goes into some of the deepest questions. Gilmore had a profound belief in reincarnation. And I felt, well, you know, we've got to come to grips with this man. This man's not an ordinary man. His crimes, and in fact his crimes are unpleasant, there's no question about it. And I don't think I spare him in the crimes, and I don't think I glorify him. I think he's a man that's going to be known, by the time I'm done with this book, if I succeed in doing what I want to do, that man's going to be known better than most people's brother. One's going to know him in every way, inside, outside. He's going to be seen through the eyes of 100 people, 200 people. There'll be no secrets about Gilmore, other than the fact that there are always secrets about a human being beyond what you learn. But I would like just once to write a long book in which we know more about one man than we're accustomed to knowing in a book. And I think if I succeed in doing that, it'll be worth it. Yes, he'll be glorified, but what will also be opened are a series of questions that I think are again, I say, I hope this is not too vainglorious, but I think these questions are vital for the 20th century. There's so much we don't know about human behavior. You know, we've been sitting smugly on Freud and Jung for 50 years now, 70 years now. We don't know a damn thing about human nature. And Gilmore poses questions that psychologists and psychiatrists can't answer. And that's why I'm fascinated by him. That's why I think he's worth the attention.
Well, you clarified it some when you started speaking exactly why I'm here. I was wondering, I mean, you're a board that dispenses privilege, and I've always thought that privileges were sought, desired, earned, and deserved. And I seek nothing from you. I don't desire anything from you. I haven't earned anything, and I don't deserve anything either. And I'd come to the conclusion that I was here because your governor, Crampton, bowed to whatever pressures were on him and decided, you know, to send me here as a last resort. I personally decided he was a moral coward for doing that. I simply accepted a sentence that was given to me. I've accepted sentences all my life. I didn't know I had a choice in the matter. When I did accept it, everybody jumped up and wanted to start to argue with me. It seems that the people, especially the people of Utah, they want the death penalty, but they don't want executions. And when it became a reality that they might have to carry one out, well, I started backing off on it. Well, I took them literal and serious when they sentenced me to death, just as if they'd have sentenced me to 10 years or 30 days in the county jail or something. I thought you were supposed to take them serious. I didn't know it was a joke. And it's, well, to paraphrase Shakespeare, much ado about nothing, really. I simply accepted the sentence, and that's all. I took it literal and serious. I understood by the Utah law that I don't have to appeal, so I chose not to. I wanted the sentence carried out. I spoke personally before your Supreme Court. They said it was okay. I figured that would end the issue.
I thought naturally for a long time of fictionalizing the book and just starting the book even in Gary Gilmore's head, doing it in, you know, that classic form, I am Gary Gilmore, they're going to execute me in the morning, and so on and so forth. And there are a number of reasons. One of them is I do trust my experience. It's what I have to go on. I mean, my capital, so to speak, is that I have 35 years of literary experience. And my experience told me that I did not understand Gilmore that way, and that I didn't dare to go in. All my instincts led me to do it from the outside, because I felt there is all this wonderful documentation, and no one's going to believe it if I do it Gilmore from the inside. If I digest the documentation and just rewrite it, write it as a novel, more or less true to the facts, no one will believe it. They'll all say, oh, well, there's Mailer with his favorite theories again, and you know, he's got these screwy ideas about how people act, and he's just using Gilmore as a pretext, but that isn't really Gary Gilmore. That's Norman Mailer, you know, Norman Mailer imagining himself a murderer and all that. And I thought, no, you know, I'm going to do it in such a way that no one can say that I put myself into the book. I'm going to found and base everything on documentary material. I'm going to write a documentary novel. And I also felt that was the most interesting way finally to approach him, because I felt he is such a complex man. See, he's not a great man, but one of the things he taught me is you don't have to be a great man to be as complicated as great men. In other words, Gilmore, I don't want to be misunderstood on this, but Gilmore might be in his own way, might be as complicated conceivably as people like Picasso or Einstein. That doesn't mean he was a genius. It doesn't mean he was a worthy artist. It doesn't mean that he's a man who has to elicit our admiration. All I would say is that men who are ordinary men, morally speaking, and men who are monsters, morally speaking, are perfectly capable of being as complex, I believe, as geniuses. And so just as one wouldn't enter Einstein's head, or one wouldn't enter Picasso's head. I mean, you'd really blanch at the thought if you're writing a novel. How do I dare to enter Picasso's head? I thought, why dare to enter this man's head? He's had 18 years in jail. What do I know, finally, what it is to spend half your life in jail? I can't even conceive what it'd be like to spend half my life in the army. And on top of that, he's the only man in history who did what he did do, and who had this one moment of genius, which is, this is the way I'm going to do it. This is going to be my revenge on society. This is going to be the way in which I square the accounts with the world. And on the other hand, had this immense and passionate belief in reincarnation. In a certain sense, he was the first martyr of reincarnation. He committed himself to reincarnation. He was making his bets that this was the time to go because his soul would be reborn in some higher form. So I thought, given all this, you can't enter his head. It's a violation. Do it from the outside, and with all this wonderful material, every reader's going to have to do his own thinking. Every reader will have to come to grips with Gilmore and decide, is the man larger or smaller than he is as presented here? Is he false? Is there a simpler explanation to him? I thought, present him in all those complexities.
It is conceivable that in 100 years' time, people will say, have you read that novel about Gary Gilmore? And because it shares so much with fiction, in the construction and the way you read it and the conversations and the thoughts that go between the characters. And obviously that's fully intended on your part. What risks were you taking there, and what was your determination in turning it into, to all intents and purposes on the surface, a novel?
I feel that novels are more real than journalism. I'm interested in capturing reality. And the novel to me is a way to capture reality, not journalism. Not the article. So that was one reason why I went toward the novelistic. But in those scenes, I almost never make up lines of dialogue in those scenes. And I'll never make up, I had certain ground rules that I established for myself, and one of them was, don't make up any lines of dialogue that change people's characters. Once in a while, if a scene is just crying for it, throw the reader that little piece of pie that he's entitled to, improve a scene just slightly. You're dying to do it anyway. I mean, I'm feeling caged at times because I get this documentary material, and if I were writing it myself, I'd have a marvelous scene, but actually what happened is not quite as good as the scene should have been. My feeling is it did happen, but they just won't admit it. But no, the ground rule is you can't push it. That's why, if you notice, there are a lot of scenes and expectations of the book that don't quite come off. You'll be reading along, and two people will meet that you were looking forward to their meeting, and it'll be a perfunctory meeting. And after a while, I thought, that's fine. That's the way it is in life all the time.
But the style is, it seems to me you've actually listened to those tapes or read that material so much that you've based the style on this colloquial, conversational, mid-American rhythm of the way they speak, and you've constructed a prose style deliberately out of that. And in fact, you change your style with person after person to tell it in an echo of the way I imagine they've spoken on the tape. Is that right?
Yes. No, that's what I certainly attempted to do, which is, one of the things I felt before I started the book is my own style has no place in this book. I mean, I've got what can one call it, sort of a Baroque style. It's terribly fancy and ornamental style, and it takes me forever to get to the point. And I love, left to myself, I love writing an awful lot about a little bit. Just let some little thing happen. I can spend 50 pages on it, and I'm perfectly happy with that. And here I had this sweep of events, this immense panorama of events in 9 months, this cast of several hundred characters, and on top of that, I had an idiom that was not my own. And so I thought, well, not only will I be obedient to the facts, I'm going to be obedient to the idiom. And so I did try to write the book in each person's voice. And that's why the first third of the book is called Western Voices. It's because there were all these people living out in Utah, and they really are, to an Easterner, they're just the shade of the cowboy is on them somehow, and they have that laconic voice, that understatement that, that in the eastern part of America we find fascinating.
You open the book with Brenda, Gary's cousin. They've known each other as children. They've started a correspondence while he's been in prison for the last 2 years. She's about 34. She's on her 4th marriage. She lives in this Mormon town, you could call it Provo. She stands for him so that he can come out on parole.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you start at that particular point? Why did you want to start there?
It just seemed to me that this was a perfect forum for it. To take the period when he comes out of jail, where he's very well observed, there's a great deal recorded about what he did. After it was a small western town, finally, Provo's not that small, it's 50,000 people and growing, but it's a small community, a small western community, really, and he made an impact on it. A great many people noticed every last little thing he did. It wasn't common for a man who'd been in prison half his life to come out at the age of 36 and take up residence in a small western town.
Yeah.
So it just, structurally, it just seemed to me to be a natural way to go at it. And I thought I'll bring in everything about his childhood and his prison experiences that comes in naturally. And what doesn't come in naturally, that I've got to have in the book, I'll get in one way or another. That's what writing is all about. You know, when you can't do things agreeably and gracefully, then you start looking for other ways to do it. But very much like life, you know.
And you take him into this family, which is Brenda, who sets herself up in a way as the moral norm. She's going to put Gary straight, although she's had a fairly rumbustious life herself. She's married to a very strong guy,
Yeah.
Johnny. And her parents are Vern and Ida, aren't they? They have a shoe shop.
Yeah.
And Vern is an immensely strong man physically.
Yes.
I mean, he can always beat Gary at arm wrestling and finger wrestling, and while he's eating his breakfast with the other hand, almost literally, isn't
Yeah,
it, once?
literally. Vern impressed me as a decent man, and there aren't that many, you know, at large in the world of literature. And I just thought it'd be fun to start with this strong, decent man who is receiving Gilmore for what I thought were essentially good motives. And his daughter, Brenda, who's sort of in life, as I hope I created her that way. She's very vivacious and forthcoming and bold and sure of herself and ready to make 3 mistakes in order to do 4 things right. You know, not at all afraid of life. And I thought, for me, there was an interesting contrast between these people who are, if you will, were, in my opinion, sort of the best of established people. Those they're established working class people who are good and they're solid and they're full of juices and they're lively and they have a rough and ready, compassionate interest in life on the one hand. And you get this man who's been, this mysterious figure who's been, in effect, tortured for 18 years in prison, coming out. I just thought it was the stuff of novels and movies and dramas. There was a dramatic contrast in them. And there's a marvelous of opportunities to see Gilmore in action. And then finally, there's one more element without which I don't think this would be a novel or a large book, and that is that his girlfriend, Nicole, I think, you know, is an extraordinary woman, and she went through an experience that was so harrowing and so thoroughgoing and so incredible and tragic for a 21-year-old that I think she had this deep need to talk about it, to go to the bottom of it, to discover everything was there. And she has a candor and an honesty about herself that's incredible. And so what came through for me is that I felt that one could begin to get to everything else about Gilmore because one knew him so well as a lover. One knew everything that was sort of good and awful about him.
Was this a real love affair, or was it just the sort of fantasy of somebody who had been in prison for so long and at least one woman would let him be there?
Everyone who talked about their romance talked about how crazy they were about each other. You know, must have been 15 or 20 people must have talked about it. There seemed no question of that they were truly in love. And then Nicole just went into this, I would only say penetrating detail about what that love was like, what was good about it, what was bad about it. And she has this immense sense of woe, you see, that she has this powerful, powerful feeling that if she'd only been able to rise to the occasion a few more times, if she'd only been a little larger during that period, he would have come around the bend.
Yeah.
And I'm not at all certain that she's wrong. You know, smart money would say, no matter what happened, she could have been 3 times as nice and he still would have gone bad. And there's always that possibility, but I'm not certain. You know, Gilmore is, as I say, is a terribly complex man, and once he's in prison and he becomes famous, his ability to grow and change in interesting directions is fascinating. He might never have been a wholly nice man. You know, far from it. But he might have mellowed out just that little bit that could have saved him.
Yeah.
You know, at which point he might have been an eccentric in the community, very strong-minded, strong-willed, and very difficult to deal with a bad temper. But he might also have been a man who, you know, could have found some happiness with her.
But this love that they have begins to slide. There's a chapter headed Gary on the slide, I think it is. And it goes into, I find an almost physically oppressive quality to read it. I was getting depressed and saying, coming down in the hotel when we were reading this book, and saying, Christ, I can't stand this. They're just the way that the house seemed to start to get dirty, the children were going around filthy, the job was going away, he was drinking too much, and of course always saying he was going to give up drinking. She was moving around a bit as well, and one of her husbands was coming back. And that too was... Did you feel there was a falling away between them there? Do you think that that was a lessening of... is that why Nicole now feels that she should have stuck it out and been larger, was the word you used, there to help him?
Yes, well, I think, you know, if you start to talk about any two people falling in love and living together, there obviously comes that time when they're tested. And, you know, almost always the elements of the testing are pretty universal. They run on the one side toward jealousy and the other side toward slovenliness. I mean, those are the two things that almost always test a love affair. You know, because after all, slovenliness is one of the great elements of dissolution of love. You know, people are living in a sloppy fashion, then how much love can there be between them? And it's an awful stretch in the book because it's terribly painful. I think to the degree that we're caught up in them and that we're rooting for them, that we want them to make it. It's very sad to watch that love affair getting worse and worse. And at that point, I don't think they were loving each other. I think she hated him, and I think she was afraid of him. I think he was beginning to hate her because she was no longer the instrument of his will. She was resisting him. I think they were getting sour on one another. And they certainly did break up, and there was no question that she wanted to be rid of him at that point. But I think that after they broke up, and after he committed those murders, I think that she descended at that point into a deeper level of herself, and she discovered that she did love him truly. I mean, it's perfectly possible to love someone, to have the surface of that love worn off completely, so we feel all we want to do is be rid of someone. And then under that, once we're rid of them, once we have that we've been desiring, which is our freedom, we're appalled, we're aghast, we're in misery, we want to be back.
When her relationship with Gilmore got worse than she could bear, Nicole went into hiding. I felt stripped of my skin, Gilmore wrote later. He drove around searching for her without success. On the night of the 19th of July, he went into a service station and murdered the attendant, Max Jensen, a 24-year-old law student with a wife and infant daughter. Gilmore took just over $100 from him at pistol point, then forced him to lie down on a washroom floor and shot him twice through the head. The next night, he staged another robbery and committed a second murder at a Provo motel just a few yards from his Uncle Vern's house. This time, the victim was a night clerk, Benny Bushnell, like Jensen, a Mormon and a respectable husband and father. Now the victim had offered the least resistance. Gilmore was arrested only hours after the second crime. He'd accidentally shot himself in his hand while trying to dispose of the murder weapon.
I'm fascinated with the criminal mind. I always have been. And so my natural emphasis was on Gilmore. When it came time to write about the people, the two men who were killed, I was awfully aware, if I'd been writing a novel, they wouldn't have been as nice and as wonderful as they are. I would have given them a few flaws. I grew up with Jules Romain's remark that few of the victims of war are innocent. And novelistically, it offended me that they were that perfect. I wouldn't have minded if there had been a few flaws in them, but you know, when we were interviewing, it's not the easiest thing in the world to interview a widow under those circumstances, so you just don't go around poking around and say, all right, now, you know, tell us about some of your husband's foul habits. You know, you just don't do that, for one thing. And for another, they were apparently rather extraordinary young Mormons. The Mormons are, you know, a social machine to create wonderfully industrious, abstemious young men. I mean, you know, there are hundreds of young Mormon men like in Provo, like those two fellas. And they just, maybe it's the fault of the method, you know, but I just couldn't find any way to, I searched and I looked and I did everything to try to make them more rounded as characters, but finally this was the portrait of them that was given to us by everyone. I found Colleen Jensen, the first widow, moving because, you know, she'd married her husband because he was an awfully nice man. He was fulfilled exactly what her idea of a husband should be, but she didn't necessarily pretend that she was vastly in love with him when she married him, but she got to love him more. And there was that feeling that they were just beginning to really be in love when he was killed. And I found that moving.
Yeah.
And then the second wife, after all, who was tiny, and her husband was so large physically, and she adored him. She worshipped him. The world turned over for her when he frowned. And then when he was lying there, because it took him quite a while to die, it took him hours to die, and some of the doctors, when he finally died, one of the doctors said to her, well, it's just as well, because if he'd lived, he would have been a vegetable. And then she says, yes, but I could have fed him and kept him warm. And I found that terribly moving. I thought, my God, there's a love. You know, here's this very simple, devout little girl, but God, she loves her husband. And I felt, you know, maybe the man wasn't created, but I felt at that point that maybe I'd succeeded in creating the love. And after all, what does it mean when you murder someone? It means that you lay waste and destroy some other part of the human firmament. You know, if we were to get laser guns that could shoot stars out of the heavens, that would be equivalent on a larger scale to what the wanton murder of one soul by another accomplishes. Things are shattered in the cosmos. So I thought, you know, after all, if you want to show what the waste of a murder is, I think what you would attempt, the way you might hope to attempt to do it, is to show that a little love is destroyed someplace.
Yeah.
Later in the book, Gilmore has a brother named Michael, who's a young intellectual and writer. And Michael's very bitter about Gary's crimes. You know, he thinks Gary used to be so amused at the way he'd go in and rob houses, and what he doesn't think about is doesn't Gary realize that when you rob a house, you spoil it for the people who live in it after that? That it may be all very well, and you may get wonderful kicks from robbing a house, and it's adventurous, and it's exciting, and it's wonderful for your personality, but it's awful for the people who are robbed. And so, you know, the intent I have here is not to, as I say, going back to glorifying Gilmore, I'm not interested in glorifying him. I'm aware of the fact that you concentrate upon a man and then you enlarge his dimensions. But it isn't the crime in the book that appeals to me nearly so much as the depth of personality, the questions of personality that Gilmore presents us with. And probably for that reason, I had to be less interested in the victims, because finally I knew so much less about them. Gilmore was my subject.
Gilmore goes back to prison and shares a cell with a guy called Gibbs.
Yeah.
And the passages devoted to Gilmore and Gibbs are, they shouldn't be. The man's murdered 2 people and so on and so forth, but they're hilarious and very, very funny, very witty, very fast. The dialogue is an American form of Cockney rhyming slang that they talk between each other. The similarities between them that Gilmore picks up are so extraordinary as to be... It's a rocketing part of the book, isn't it?
And it's a side of Gilmore that's altogether different. You get a sense of him in prison.
He's the most intelligent there. I mean, he's very, very intelligent when he's with Gibbs.
Yeah.
Is that because he feels, and he comes over much more intelligently, that's because that's his habitat, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, what you realize, or I think what you realize, looking back at all the time he was in Provo and he was acting so odd and so silly, and is he a stupid man? What is he? He was absolutely out of his element. It's as if I were to find myself in Bucharest tomorrow, you know, not speaking a word, you know, not even knowing whether Romanian was Hungarian or whatever, you know. Yeah. And I was struck with that when I came across what Gibbs had to say about Gilmore. I realized, my God, that was Gilmore's element. He understood prisons. He was so much more powerful in prison. It's just that in prison, his acting is much better. Yeah. He was unconvincing on the outside. He's always acting a role. In prison, the roles he acts are roles that he plays with great skill. It's just like if you take a certain kind of ham actor or stock actor, if you give them a role they're not comfortable in, everything that's bad about their acting shows. Put them in a role that they've been playing all their lives that they're good at, and they could be superb. You could even assume for a while that they're a great actor if they're playing the role of their life. And Gilmore's a little bit like that. The better I've gotten to know Gilmore, the more he reminds me of certain movie stars I've known. I don't mean that he has their charisma or that he has their style of life, or I'm not saying the reverse of that all movie stars are murderers. What I'm saying is that funny relation he bears to his own personality I've seen only in movie stars.
Which is, how would you describe that?
It's as if they are observing their own behavior fully as much as the people who are observing them. And Gilmore is of that order. He's always observing his own behavior. As he does something, if it doesn't work, he'll shift his personality over to another place. For a man of passions, he's singularly passionless in a way and calculating.
Yeah. But intensity comes to him in prison too, and a sort of coherence in the letters, these letters which by any standards are remarkable letters that he writes to Nicole in a fury of feeling dispossessed and possessing her and confessing and reclaiming. And
I think some of the greatest letters of jealousy I've ever read. That is, never is jealousy expressed so nakedly as in those letters.
the media moved in very heavily on Gilmore. Did it change him? Do you think it changed him? Do you discover a different Gilmore after? I mean, when he was sentenced to death, there were less than 20 people in the court, and so there we were, as he said. And he'd killed 2 men in cold blood, murdered 2 men in cold blood. But there were less than 20 people in court. Deseret Muse, that was it. Then he was going to be shot, and he insisted on being shot, and it's boom, isn't it? It's Playboy interviews, it's can various television stations get their camera there, it's fighting for the right, it's auctioning this, it's... Now, did Gilmore change in that process? Was he waiting for that? What did that do to him?
Well, it changed him. And if there was a challenge implicit in it, and I think whenever the media attaches themselves to anyone, the challenge implicit in it is, do you not collapse? Yes. After all, even presidential candidates have collapsed under the pressure of facing the media constantly. You know, they make one remark that's ill-chosen and they lose their presidential chances. That's happened to a couple of them along the way. Gilmore, of course, didn't have to worry about that. He could make 1,000 mistakes with the media. It hardly mattered that way. But what was involved is that his own importance, not only to others but to himself, kept shifting at a vast rate. And an immense amount of money relative to what he'd had before began to come his way. I mean, he was a man who never started smoking. And the reason he gave for it is that he just, since he had no money in prison, his mother was very poor, and nobody in his family had any money, and so there was no money coming in, and he was in isolation a good deal of the time. He just didn't want to get into a situation where he wouldn't have the money for cigarettes and would be craving them. So he had smoked a little, but he cut them out of his life. He just wasn't going to smoke. He was a man who had that little money, and now he's gotten $50,000. And he's given $2,000 to one old friend and $3,000 to another, and he's just throwing his money away. Just giving it to people in huge sums. A girl writes him a nice, sexy letter from Honolulu, and he sends her $300, that sort of thing. So there are all these changes in his life. I mean, the man's had no attention and no money, and now he's got both in great degree. And he also started having relations with people of a sort he never had before, because by the time he was executed, he'd had 2 lawyers, the same 2 lawyers, for a period of, almost 2 months. And they were both Mormons and both highly established small-town lawyers, with all that means, as they were very dependable, very regular, very decent men, more or less. And I say more or less because it's hard to think of a lawyer as being very decent. I mean, it's enough if a lawyer is decent after all. And one wouldn't want a lawyer who was very decent. One wouldn't get one's fair half of the chicanery in any legal process. And he gets to be friends with them. They really mourn him by the time he's gone. They get to like him. And that is a relation he's never had before in his life. To me, that's fascinating, because he never before been able to come close to anyone who was an establishment figure. He comes close to his relative, Vern D'Amico, before the book is over. They get to love one another. He goes through a great many changes that way. He also begins to be put into the position of a Solomon. He has to make all sorts of decisions and choices about what's going to be done with the parts of his body. Which parts are given to charity, which parts will be cremated. He has to make all kinds of decisions in relation to the legal processes, because there are people who are trying to keep him alive against his will. Then there are people who are trying to carry out his will quite independently of him. The state wants to execute him on time. They can't bear this circus that's suddenly descended upon Utah. They want to be rid of Gilmore. Gilmore wants to be rid of Gilmore. The ACLU and various liberal forces are coming in from all over the country to try to save Gilmore's life, not because they're tremendously enchanted with his life, but because finally they're afraid that his execution may kick off a wave of executions all over the place. So all these forces start to impinge on him.
And straightforward fan mail, about 40,000 letters.
Altogether, he gets 40,000 letters.
Yeah.
So he's reading, there are scenes where various chaplains come in on him, and he's sitting on the floor with a blanket and letters all around him. He just takes a bunch and he says, here, read these. He hands them a bunch. You know, if you see any interesting ones, pass them to me. He's become a movie star, in effect, but a movie star on the full rise of popularity. And with it all, he grows. I mean, he still shows all the difficult, knotty, unpleasant sides of his nature over and over and over. It isn't as if he suddenly becomes this wonderful fellow, far from it. But what you do see is, yes, the man does have a capacity to grow. He's not simply that habit-ridden, petty monster that he was in the early stages who arouses our compassion because he's so trapped and is incapable of kissing good luck on the mouth. You know, he begins to rise to a degree in stature. He begins to assume some part of that role that history has given him. And that's almost awesome to see the growth in the man. As I say, it's a partial growth, and it's not at all in a straightforward line. He does something good, and then he'll do something god-awful right afterward. He'll make a very wise decision, then he'll be so petty and so childish the next moment that you just throw up your hands. But slowly you see the man moving toward this idea he has himself. He wants to die with dignity, and he wants it carried through. And he wants to establish a few simple things about himself. And one of them is that he's serious about this death. And for reasons you almost can't begin to name. You see, you can't begin to say at this point, well, is he a man of such pride, of the kind of pride that's bred after 20 years in prison where you weren't broken, that finally he has set this bluff up, it's a poker bluff, and he will carry it through until he's killed? You see, because by now there's no doubt at all that if he just says, I want to appeal, every force in the legal system will, he could stay alive now for years if he wants to, because all the appeal machinery is open to him, if only he'll take it. He can stay alive for the rest of his life in prison. He can probably get his sentence commuted to life imprisonment. There were probably a few irregularities in his trial. You know, any number of things he can do if he wants to. But no, he keeps forcing this issue. The state said I was guilty and sentenced to death. Let the state carry out its sentence. And he forces his own death. And of course, all the people who are opposed to his execution are saying the man's mad, he's suicidal. The state is collaborating on a suicide. This is heinous, this is odious, this is monstrous.
And he does attempt to take his life, or
attempts to take his life twice, once with Nicole, once alone.
Yeah.
Nicole's been put into a mental hospital because of the attempt to take her life with Gary. The lovers are separated. He's all alone. And through it all, he moves toward the day of his execution with this kind of implacable will. It's exactly like a general who's decided that a certain mountain must be taken on a front. You know, that hill must be taken at all costs. We are going to take that hill, and nothing will stop us. It's exactly like reading one of those sagas about that general who, you know, people came back with reports of this front collapsing and that flank in terrible trouble. He said, no matter, we go forward. And with it, he also, where you see this is in the way he handles the lawyers. They come to him with what's going on, and he describes, he gives them his reactions of what to do. Sometimes he's intelligent as hell, sometimes he's silly. But, you know, as a lawyer, he's able to deal with other lawyers. You begin to see that the man's intelligence is not profound, but it's a practical intelligence that's working very practically and quietly and efficiently for his own end. And, you know, it's off the normal spectrum of human behavior completely. And yet he's not the least bit insane. I mean, I think one thing...
That's established clearly. Report after report after report throughout his prison sentences and after his... that there was no sign of...
But, you know, I don't have to believe the psychiatrist. If he is insane, if people insist that he's insane after all this, then they've got to redefine the nature of insanity altogether, because he's, you know, in quiet ways, quiet, systematic ways, he's immensely effective in the last part of his life.
And yet behind this is the implacable meaninglessness of these two murders. He needn't have killed those two men, need he, at all? It seemed, why did he says that it was to do with rage, and rage expresses itself, and this was his expression of rage. Oh, well, he you know, over and over again, what he says is that it had nothing to do with the men, it had nothing to do with the robberies, that he killed because, he says, in effect, I killed because I had more rage in myself than I could control at that point. One commits murder, or one is a suicide, in order to save one's soul. And that's the part of karma that I think will always prove indigestible to civilized society. Because the idea that there's something more important
than the life we live on this earth is anathema to civilized society. Civilization is built on the firm premise that we have one life and one life only, and that if we waste this one life, there's nothing worse we can do. You see, and Gilmore runs counter to that, which I think is one of the reasons that he arouses this intense antagonism in many, many people where it's almost surprising. You know, I've seen people who are perfectly pleasant liberal people who just practically gnash their teeth when they hear about Gilmore, because he cuts at the very, you know, in a certain sense you could say Gilmore is one of the great conservatives of the 20th century, because he cuts at the ankles of every liberal premise.
Just after dawn on the 17th of January 1977, Gilmore was taken from his maximum security cell to the prison cannery building where a firing squad waited for him. At 8:07 a.m. he was shot dead. Soon afterwards the press were allowed to inspect the scene of the execution. Gilmore had been strapped to an old office chair while a hood had been placed over his head and a target pinned over his heart. Then the order had been given to fire, and the 5 volunteer marksmen behind the screen 30 feet away had opened fire. Some of the official witnesses, including Gilmore's lawyers and his Uncle Vern, talked about the execution at a press conference afterwards.
I would like to say at this time that Gary, my nephew, he died like he wanted to die, in dignity. It was very upsetting to me, but he got his wish. He did die, and he died in dignity. That's all I have to say.
We spent the entire night with Mr. Gilmore. He tried constantly to help us, to buoy our spirits. He was even trying to teach us how to box, and how to dance a little bit with Tony. He did a better job than some of us. He was always trying to keep the spirit light, because he made the statement that he had received a gift. And that gift was that he knew when he was going to die, and he could make the arrangements. And therefore, he was indeed fortunate. When I talked with him in the wee hours of the morning, he did express thanks for many of the things that happened to him, and he expressed sorrow for the deeds that he did.
Gilmore was not a religious leader, but he was the stalking horse, or the vanguard of something that's going to be immensely more important in 50 years or 100 years. I think Western civilization is going around a tremendous bend, and we're approaching Eastern concepts of reincarnation and karma and what have you, and the next great religion of the future, which will probably be some new form of Christianity, if you want me to just speculate wildly, will have implicit in it notions of reincarnation that we just don't begin to have today. And at that time, Gilmore will almost be a symbol of this period. Not a symbol, but he'll be the man, the first man who how can I put it, he'll be an historical figure at that point.
When you started this, you were a long way through a big novel that I take it for granted, that means an enormous amount to you, and a huge work of fiction. You were 800 or 900 pages into it. And you explained that the reasons for taking this, you were quite straightforward about the financial reasons you undertook it, and you thought it would be a quick job and get it over with. Well, you could have done a quick job, obviously, but you haven't. You've been drawn into it, and the thing has become an immense book, and from my reading of it anyway, it's an immensely powerful book where you're attacking the character of not so much one man as of a society, and of a society that is representative of that represents various contradictory forces and is stalemating itself all over the place, contradicting itself always through character, in the way that the 19th century novelists did. I mean, it is the comparisons that I would draw would be with 19th century novels.
It's fascinating that you say that, because, you know, it's been one of my thoughts that the documentary novel as such goes back to the 19th century novel in many ways, including the fact that usually in the documentary novel you have almost no sex. Because after all, people, if you're interviewing people, They're not going to tell you about their sex lives normally. In this book, there is the exception that Nicole and a few other people are quite frank about their sexual lives for various reasons. But normally, there's no sex in these books. And so what you get is you get a study of people in society with their character impinging on society, society impinging on them. That's very 19th century, with all the virtues of the 19th century novel, too, which is you can have a large panorama. And you can have an omniscient, godlike eye observing everyone's mind and all that.
Well, you had all that because the range of characters is enormous. I mean, you take us into the background. You literally do tell us how people were born, where they went to college, what their degrees were, what almost, in American terms, what their income is, their lifestyles are. Lawyers, small businessmen, policemen, perverts, drug addicts, college students, a whole range of people, and you're taking on in a bigger way than I can think of any contemporary American writer or British writer, certainly in that way. A huge sort of swathe across society. Is this the kind of, I presume, unexpected land that's drawn you into writing at such length and so obsessively about this?
I think what drew me in is that, you know, I've always, ever since The Naked and the Dead, there's always been a part of me that's been a social novelist and more frustrated over the years because I never found a way to write a large social novel. I've always wanted to, and I just never found a story simply as simple as that. And so with this, I found, well, here is the perfect social novel. You know, and the fact that it has the, as Kissinger once said, it has the added advantage of being true. And, you know, and ever since the 60s in America, I've decided that God is a better novelist than any of us. Because none of us writing in the 50s would have dreamed of writing about the America that took place in the 60s. It was beyond our imaginations. It was sort of more dramatic, more surrealistic, more fanciful, more incredible, more vivid than anything we would have dared to write about.
Are you implying that these great fictions, these panoramic fictions, those fictions where you introduce a huge number of people in society, they can't exist anymore out of a current imagination? They've got to be found, they've got to be given by documentary events or something like that.
I think that it may be that we'll go through a period of documentary novels in order to learn how to rethink the problem of the novel. One of the feelings I have is that after writing this, it'd be much easier for me now to write a panoramic novel. Because what it's opened up to me is how much I've been missing. One of the reasons I've not been able to write a panoramic novel is I haven't had enough curiosity. I haven't looked into enough corners when I'm looking at a large situation. I tend to, one of my flaws has been I've always tended to focus upon the main character and not see the secondary cast and how important they are. So working on this book, where the only way I could approach the main characters through the secondary cast, I've kind of realized that, oh no, I mean, a novel, a panoramic novel has to have immense roots. And you know, for what it's worth, I think if I ever do such a novel again as a complete fiction, not based on something, this book has been an incredible help for it. Maybe the same will be true for other novelists. In other words, there may be a period, I'm just guessing, when a good many novelists may start to do documentary novels for a period as a way of relocating their craft.
Why do you think fiction is so important?
Oh, because I think finally it's the place where art and philosophy and adventure come together. To me, there's nothing more beautiful than a marvelous novel. I mean, I love the idea of a novel. To me, a novel is better than a reality. I mean, as good as this book may become, I hope it becomes a very, very good book. It can never be as good as a novel in my mind. It could be better than a novel in a lot of ways, but it can never be as good. Because it wasn't conceived finally by, you know, I mean, there's something so beautiful about one mind finally being able to come up with a vision that's not godlike, but close enough to the godlike to give us a vision of how marvelous the Lord's mind might be. You know, when we read Proust or The Best of Man or Stendhal or any of the great novelists or Joyce, name them, you know, we can name 20 of them, let's say, who give us this idea of God's mind must be something like that. I mean, don't you have that feeling when you read Proust? You know, that one side of God's mind is like Proust's mind. And so, I mean, that's the challenge.
Thank you. Norman Mailer on Brooklyn Heights, reflecting on the life and death of Gary Gilmore. Clearly the book's a remarkable achievement, though in my opinion it is too long. In the second half, dealing with the media, the style and approach fit the subject less satisfactorily. Maybe there's too much material, and the sense of other voices dies away. Yet in the first half, there's a description of the decency and the sexual squalor, the violence and the resources of Middle America as acute and wide-ranging as anything else I can think of in modern literature. In it, Mailer, who in the 50s audaciously said he wanted to change the consciousness of his generation, seems back in the ring and writing fit, ready to take on the USA of the 80s.